Alright guys, welcome back to Combat Athlete Physio YouTube channel, where we take human movement science and we bring it to the combat sports. And welcome to Module 104 of our Intro to Combat Sports Biomechanics course. In the last video, we broke down planes of movement. We talked about what planes of movement were, and we talked about the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. And today, we're taking the next step, axes of rotation. So here's a very basic definition. An axis of rotation is an imaginary line around which movement occurs. So I like to think of it like a hinge on a door. The door rotates about the hinge. That's its axis. Like we talked about in the last video, when we're moving through a plane, we're rotating about a perpendicular axis. So each plane has a matching axis. Very much like in the last video, this is a lot easier to explain visually. So let's look at the planes of motion and the corresponding axes of rotation in action. Okay, so here in our Human Anatomy Atlas app, we're going to look at the first axis of rotation, which is a medial to lateral axis of rotation. Okay, so we're going to have to draw from several of the things in our previous modules. We're going to have to know what anatomical neutral position is. We have to know what medial and lateral means. We also have to know what the sagittal plane is. Okay, so spinal extension is starting from that anatomical neutral position, and this is where the spine is moving backwards or bending backwards from that anatomical neutral position. We also know now that the plane of movement that's denoted here by the circle that's cutting the body into right and left halves is known as the sagittal plane. So spinal extension, we have a sagittal plane movement. Now for the medial lateral axis of rotation. So sagittal plane movements all have a medial to lateral axis of rotation, meaning that the line is moving medial to lateral or lateral to medial, depending on your frame of reference, which is in the anatomical neutral position, and it is perpendicular to the plane of movement. So I'm going to give you a really big kind of rotation here so you can see it all the way around. This is a two-dimensional software trying to depict a three-dimensional action moving. All right, so just to wrap it all up, sagittal plane movements, like spinal extension, for example, have an axis that is moving medially to laterally. Sagittal plane movements, medial to lateral axis of rotation. Okay, so for the next axis of rotation, we have anterior to posterior or posterior to anterior, depending on your frame of reference. Okay, so let's orient ourselves using what we already know. So we've got this anatomical neutral position. We have the plane of movement that is cutting the body relatively. This is something that I had to draw by hand, so it's not exact, but it's cutting the body from front half to back half, so front and back halves, and we know this is showing us the frontal plane. So cervical side bending or lateral flexion is the movement here, and it's moving through the frontal plane, which means that the axis of rotation has to move or pierce it perpendicular. So that would have to mean that it's running in an anterior or from the front of the body to the back of the body, or from the back of the body to the front of the body, depending on where you are and what movement you're describing. Okay, so cervical side bending is a movement that is moving through the frontal plane and that is moving about an axis of rotation that is going perpendicular to it from an anterior position to a posterior position. So frontal plane movements like cervical side bending have an axis of anterior to posterior axis of rotation. All right, and for the last axis of rotation, we have the superior to inferior or inferior to superior axis of rotation, piercing through, in a perpendicular fashion, my favorite transverse plane. Okay, so we have shoulder external rotation happening about or through that movement. Now, I didn't draw it all the way down where you see this moving, but I did draw it a little bit closer to the actual joint that's moving, which would be the glenohumeral joint. Okay, so I'm going to move this a little higher, and you could tell that the superior to inferior, remember our anatomical term, superior just means above, and inferior means below. So since the transverse plane, like we learned in the plane module, is theoretically cutting the body into top and left halves, and rotational movements move through that plane, the axis of rotation has to be perpendicular, which would mean that it's running from a superior position to an inferior or vice versa. So transverse plane movements like shoulder external rotation are happening about the superior to inferior axis. So why do axes of rotation matter in the combat sports? Because every single movement happens about an axis. Understanding the axis of rotation can help you understand a ton of things biomechanically, like what muscle is producing the movement, what plane of motion the movement is moving through, and how to maybe calculate things like torque, which is going to come way later. For example, in a spinning back fist, the torso is rotating through the transverse plane, which means that the axis has to be running vertical. Like in a wrestling or judo hip throw, you've got a sagittal plane movement for the level change, and then you pivot your hips, which happens in the frontal plane, and then you finish with rotation of the trunk, creating a lot of torque, which happens around the transverse plane. So a really common mistake is confusing planes of movement with axis of rotation. So there's two shortcuts that I like to teach my students when I'm doing clinical instruction. The first is that our bodies move through planes of motion and around axes of rotation. And the second is, think of the plane of motion like a wheel that's spinning, and the axis of rotation is the axle that runs through it. That way it's really hard to mix them up. So just a quick recap. The axis of rotation is essentially just a line around which a movement occurs. Each plane has a perpendicular axis. The sagittal plane has a mediolateral axis. The frontal plane has an anterior-posterior axis. And then the transverse plane has a vertical or superior to inferior axis. All right, you know it wouldn't be a module without a quiz. So question number 1, which axis of rotation does a roundhouse kick primarily use? A, medial lateral, B, anterior posterior, or C, vertical. Number 2, true or false? A movement in the frontal plane rotates about a vertical axis. Number 3, if a fighter slips a punch moving side to side, about what axis are they rotating? One more time. If a fighter slips a punch from moving side to side, about what axis are they rotating? Lock in your answers, and then as always, they'll be in the pinned comment of the next module. Speaking of the next module, module 105 is going to be starting our joint-specific modules. So we're going to start at the cervical spine and look at all the movements in the cervical spine. We're going to identify their planes of movement, their axis of rotation. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.